Hi, everyone. Welcome. If you've attended our events, you sort of know some of the routine here, which is that it takes us a little time to get everyone into the Zoom room. So we're just going to do a little light chat here until we have quite a large audience this evening who are here to see our esteemed speaker, Joanna Christodoulou. We're so excited to have her here with us. So we're wishing you a happy Thursday night. And this is actually the last speaker series event of this year. It's been our great pleasure to host you several Thursday nights. And I was just talking with Joanna about the fact that the really fortuitous thing about tonight is not only that will you get to see Joanna, but you could also make it to the Celtics game, to the TV afterwards to watch that game. So we're just going to take a few more minutes and let people filter in. We have quite a large group. Thank you so much. So welcome if you're just joining us. I'm here with Joanna Christodoulou. Happy Thursday night. This is our final speaker series event of the year. We're so excited that you chose to spend it with us. Just going to take about another few minutes and not even few, maybe part of a minute to let people filter into the Zoom room before we move ahead with our program. We wanted to let you know that we will be recording this session. Should anyone in your family, a friend, colleague want to see it, we will be making it available on our website thereafter. In addition, at the end of the session, we will have an opportunity for questions. As in our previous events, we do not have the chat enabled, but welcome you, please, during the presentation by Joanna Christodoulou to please put your questions in the Q&A feature. Joanna and I will attempt to get to all your questions, and anything that we don't have time for this evening. The final slide will have a parent questions email. You're welcome to email them there, or we will catalog all the questions and attempt to get to everyone on email. So just kind of filtering in a final few people. Okay, we were going to, before we hand it over to Joanna, I'm going to do a quick poll and then I'm going to do a more formal introduction of Joanna. I'm going to go in that order. So I'm joined tonight by Jen Brock and Amy Dempster, who have phenomenally other jobs at Carroll, but who are helping us on the back end here with our Zoom event. So Jen, if you wanted to go ahead and launch the poll, we're curious who's in the audience this evening. And the question, how are you connected to Carroll? We're trying to sort of understand who is our demographic here. So Jen, I'm not seeing the results. Maybe you are.
Yep, so if I end this, I think you'll be able to see them. It looks like we've got a really nice distribution. About 67% of our folks here are Carroll faculty and staff, but we have a nice selection of families and folks from our board of trustees and learning professionals from the broader Carroll community.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So I'm going to formally introduce Joanna Christodoulou, who we are so honored and so excited to have her here. She's been a tremendous partner at Carroll. Joanna holds several degrees from Harvard and Tufts and did her postdoc work at MIT. Joanna is currently a professor at MGH, teaches at Harvard, and is the recipient of countless grants. If I were to list them all off, we'd be here actually all night, from the NIH, the National Science Foundation, and MGH. So tonight we're here with Joanna, who's going to discuss reading outcomes and socioeconomic status from a developmental, educational, and neuroscientific perspective. Joanna, thank you so much. It is our honor to have you.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you all. Welcome to this evening and this evening's presentation. I could not be happier to be joining you tonight. I'm looking forward to the Q&A, so please, along the way, just share any of your thoughts, questions, or comments, and I'll be eager to engage with you. Think of this as a launching of a discussion that we can continue after it's over as well. So what I'm excited to speak with you about tonight is thinking about reading development through context. And when we talk about context, the way that I'll be describing it is thinking about socioeconomic context. I'm going to be using that as a specific lens to consider diversity. Diversity includes so many different categories, and the two that I'll be honing in on tonight are the diversity that comes from disadvantages related to socioeconomic status, which I'll describe in a moment, as well as the diversity that comes from being a learner who learns differently. And so I know today's group and audience is especially interested and invested in supporting our learners of all varieties. I'm going to be honing in on this perspective of socioeconomic disadvantage to give us a lens through which to understand how reading unfolds and how it can unfold in different ways depending on the inputs and experiences and access you have to resources in your setting. I'll share some cognitive neuroscience information to help enhance what we learn and what we know about reading that we observe in classrooms and at home. And I'll want to really emphasize throughout the presentation that things are malleable, that the circumstances that we may be born into or have the resources that we might have access to, all of those influence us, but what the most important, impactful thing to put our energy toward are what is changeable and malleable. And all of us are invested in education, which is one of the best examples of how learning can change the brain. Brain plasticity, or the flexibility of the brain to adapt to inputs that are coming through on a regular basis, is the whole basis of what we aim to do with our readers, those who struggle, those who don't, and foster their full potential. So through these topics, I'm going to walk us through this idea of context from socioeconomic status. So this is a word you may have come across before, and I'm going to often use the shorthand of SES instead of saying the whole phrase. And what it is the access an individual has to financial, educational, economic, and social resources. And even more relevant is the benefit and social standing that come from having those resources. So it's not just the money in the bank, it's also who you know, who your social circle is, how many phone calls away you are from a resource that you may not have known about otherwise. And in the research context, it's measured in a very straightforward way, which is we invite the parents in the home setting or the guardians to share with us at their comfort level what the highest level of education was attained by the heads of the household, what the household income is, and the occupation of the heads of household. And with that information, we have a way to calculate SES and give it a score. And so the higher the score represents higher SES or more resources or more social standing, and lower SES, of course, is on the other end. So socioeconomic status is on a continuum. And the most important thing in my perspective about SES is really the experience a person has in their particular circumstances. So what the metrics of SES don't capture is the personal narrative, the subjective experience. What it instead does often measure in the research context is the objective story of how much education, how much financial resource is at the disposal of a household. It doesn't often take into account cost of living, whether you're living in a suburb or in the country or in the city. And it doesn't take into account often how you feel relative to the lifestyle you want or need. So that kind of just sets us up to think about SES in the research context, often measured with a score that I think of as a proxy. So we use SES as a metric, it's a proxy for, and that can include a lot of things. And I'd love to think with you about what are the kinds of things that metric, that number of SES can represent, and how that can be meaningfully translated to educational experiences. So to just clear up all the terminology even further, I just wanted to introduce the term poverty, which we're all familiar with, but I wanted to quantify poverty and give it a specific anchor point in our discussion. So given that socioeconomic status is along a continuum, on the tail end of one side of that continuum is where there's severe financial need. So the government puts out a poverty guideline each year, and it indicates the least amount of income a person or family needs to meet their basic needs. So for a family with 4 people in the household, that poverty guideline is $26,500. So you can imagine what that would take to survive on that amount of money for a family of 4. And you might imagine that there are families in that circumstance struggling to meet their basic needs. Now that's, as I mentioned, one end of the continuum. And when I share with you the distribution of socioeconomic status in the US more generally, it often is parsed into 3 categories: upper, middle, and lower. So about 19% of the US population falls into the upper, about 52% in the middle, and about 29% in the lower category. But I think it is really grounding to see what that corresponds to in terms of annual household income. So a family is considered upper socioeconomic status if the annual income is around $145,500. And that's for a family of 3, and that's adjusted for cost of living in an urban setting. And even more surprising potentially for us tonight is middle income, middle SES is quite a wide range, all the way from 48,500 up to 145,500, and lower SES is below that cutoff. So hopefully this just gives you some anchor points to think about what are people thinking about or referring to when they're referring to the range of socioeconomic status, and where might your family fall? Where might you have been when you were growing up? Where do the community members you are among situate themselves in this way? There's a link on the slide which you'll have access to, and on that link you can search for your own area. So I just plugged in for the Boston, Cambridge, Newton area, which is the kind of vicinity here. You can see that actually we have a higher proportion of upper SES families as compared to the national norm, about the same middle and a little bit less on the lower end. So you can just kind of situate yourselves with those numbers. Now, the reason that socioeconomic status is so important as a lens through which to evaluate educational outcomes and performance is because the vulnerability that students carry when they are in low SES contexts come from many factors. So the kinds of things that are linked to lower SES backgrounds include things like chronic or toxic stress, exposure to violence, poor nutrition, reduced access to healthcare, exposure to toxins, you can imagine lead paint or things like this, limited educational resources, and parents and caregivers often not being as available as they may want to be or could be. So when we think about the kinds of risk factors that are associated with lower SES, there's actually a phrase that's often used called ACEs for short. ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So ACEs is just a framework that the government launched a study to see, given all the potential adverse childhood experiences, how might they impact children over time through adulthood and into the healthcare realm. So this study did not measure reading or academic outcomes, but what they did find was that they organized ACEs into categories like abuse, neglect, or household challenges, as well as other adversities that might come from your neighborhood circumstances or from natural disasters or otherwise. And how the story unfolds is taking the accumulation of ACEs that children may experience and thinking of them not just as mattering at that moment, but thinking about what the long-term potential implications may be for those sorts of things. So for children who repeatedly and are chronically experiencing adversity, the worry is that they would be experiencing toxic stress. So toxic stress is the way in which your body is always readied for fight or flight with elevated stress, manifesting as higher cortisol levels. And this toxic stress biologically can impact the way that your internal systems work, whether that's your brain development or the processing of your systems related to digestion or immunity or otherwise. And downstream, it can have impacts that are consequential for your health as an adult. So the ways in which it might impact people in adulthood can range all the way from chronic health conditions and mental health conditions to the choices they make for their health risk and for social outcomes. So the idea is if you have roughly 4 or more ACEs, your chances of these adverse outcomes are elevated. But this is all in the context of thinking of, if we know what the vulnerabilities are earlier, then we know what the opportunities are for impact sooner. So in no way is this a one-lane deterministic approach to thinking about vulnerability. And in fact, I'm sure many of you in the audience are examples of overcoming adversity in your own lives. One way in which we think about how the story of SES and context is relevant for things like academic development is to think about, again, this word of brain plasticity. So brain plasticity, again, is our capacity to have the ways in which our regions of the brain connect to each other and are orchestrated change over time, depending on what we are being asked from our environment to use our brain for. And so the reason that we can change the brain is because the plasticity piece allows for it to be flexible and how the brain is used and how it's tailored to respond to life as it happens to us. So there's something really interesting to think about, which is we might think that faster maturing might have some advantages. But one thing that some researchers have been thinking through is that when it comes to brain development, slower maturation is more favorable. So let me say a little bit about what I mean by that. Sometimes people might have the question, how do I help my child develop faster? I would love for them to just be quicker to read when they're 4 years old, or quicker to be able to do X, Y, and Z. But I just offer that the goal isn't to make children develop faster, but to let them remain children longer. And that's actually an adapted quote from Alison Gopnik, who wrote a Wall Street Journal article I'd love to share, describing this article that has the slide in front of us. So on the slide, we're seeing experiences in life broken up into negative to positive and repetitive to uncommon or rare. And the idea that these researchers put forth is that when a child is in circumstances that allow for surprising, positive, exciting, enhancing life experiences, those are priming the brain to be able to enhance the maturation period to make it longer. In other words, staying a kid longer. In contrast, for kids who are experiencing challenges that are in this category, that are over and over negative consequences of their circumstances, that often can accelerate their brain maturation, which goes hand in hand with this reduced plasticity piece, which is not seen as something positive. So part, again, of the goal isn't to make anyone develop faster, but to help children remain children longer. So we might think about, well, how do all of these risk factors matter for something like reading? Should those two things be separate and independent? So just to give you a bit of context there, when we think about the vulnerability offered from lower socioeconomic status context, we can think about it in 3 categories. One is that there's material deprivation. That means that there may not be a lot of or sufficient opportunities for education in the home setting. There may not be sufficient nutrition available, but even the language environment, there's been some fascinating research that shows that the number of times that parents and kids exchange language, a serve and return, they sometimes call it, that is one of the best predictors of language outcomes and language development for young kids, as opposed to how many words a child hears. So there are so many entry points for impact for improving circumstances that might start off being vulnerable. So it's a theme I just continue to want to come back to. So in addition to material deprivation, there's also the category of stressors, and that can come from this toxic stress place. Stress by itself is not a bad thing. In fact, there's different types of stress. Stress described as spelled as EU or eustress is actually something that's motivating and positive. Toxic stress is when it gets to be a problem because it has the body always readied in a fight or flight mode, and that elevated stress level as we mentioned before, can have some challenges for the developing system. So in addition to this, material deprivation and stressors, we've also got potential environmental toxins. So those pieces, each in their own way, can have potential impact on biological mechanisms, which could be a range of entry points. So it could be on the stress response function. It could be on how your genes and environment are interacting. And the most relevant part for us is that it could also impact how the brain is wired and connected and structured in regions that support language, reading, memory, and executive function. So let me say that one more time to back it up. The risk factors that come with lower SES are associated with vulnerability, particularly in reading, language, and executive function. So what we have to share here, the difference between higher and lower SES children is highest for the categories of language and literacy in particular. And that's where it brings in this relevance of thinking about SES as a really important frame of reference to have for understanding reading development and how it unfurls. So socioeconomic status is one of the strongest predictors of academic achievement and cognitive skill, and this is during childhood and beyond. And there's a phrase called the achievement gap. The achievement gap refers to the gap between students who are higher and lower SES in their academic outcomes like reading or math. The difference between students with high and low SES is called the achievement gap because there's no reason why the potential, the cognitive bandwidth, the resources that a child has or should have should not be the lower SES kid. There's no reason besides what's standing in their way circumstantially that are impacting their potential to succeed. So our goal is to close that achievement gap, to give all students the opportunities that they deserve and need to foster their skill sets and their potential fully. And when we unpack that a little bit, we can see some data from a national reading assessment that's given to 4th, 8th, and 12th graders throughout the country. And for years, since the inception of this standardized test, the gap between higher and lower income students has held quite steady. So there's been almost no strong closing of that gap, despite a lot of educational effort and focus in that area. So again, this is another website that you're welcome to explore that I have on the slide there. But this is representing every school district in the country, every single one. So you could look up the district that you're in or what you grew up in or et cetera. But the idea is showing that the higher SES students are performing higher on educational assessments, and students from lower SES communities are performing lower on those assessments. And I pulled up the data for the county that the Carroll School is in, so you can see for this particular district, actually the test scores are higher than the US average, and here's where it's located relative to all those bubbles. The learning rates are faster than the US average, and SES is above average. So this is something just to situate ourselves, whatever circumstances we may be in, you can imagine what the circumstances might be and how different they may be for families and communities in these blue bubbles down here, of which there are plenty. So I think this is basically an exercise just to situate us in this very, very broad context of community members throughout the country and the differences in their accessibility of appropriate, fair, fulfilling educational opportunities in spite of low SES. So of course, our main interest is really bringing all of this to the discussion around learners who struggle with reading. And that's what my career is dedicated to, and that's what I'm really happy to be joining you tonight to talk about. So when we think about SES and reading and students who have been identified with specific learning disabilities, I'm showing you here a chart where school entry, so when kids start school at kindergarten, this brings us all the way up to 3rd grade. And this graph is showing us what are the differences for students who are without any reading issues. Well, even at the start of school, there's already a difference between students who are higher and lower SES. So there's a disadvantage at the outset of your educational career based entirely on SES with no relevance to potential or skill set. So that disadvantage is a vulnerability that students carry at the outset. Now, what I want to compare that to is when we think about students with learning disabilities, like in reading, this is the orange lines, even students who are high and low SES are differentiated in the category of LD. So let me repeat that one more time. We're looking at the two orange lines. The solid orange line are students with specific learning disabilities who are higher SES, and the dashed orange line are students with specific learning disabilities who are lower SES. And they too, just looking at those two lines, are already gapped at the beginning. But what's notable to share is that when we think about the story of socioeconomic status and learning disabilities, the first thing to notice is that there is a huge gap. That gap is big between high and low SES for kids with no reading issues, but that gap is even bigger when you look at students with learning disabilities, higher and lower SES. Another thing to point out is that if we take a look at comparing how big the gap is between the blue lines and how big the gap is between the orange lines, it turns out that for readers with no reading issues, higher SES is a boost. And because higher SES is associated with more resources and more availability of important factors before kids start school and during school. But the gap between higher and lower SES isn't as big for students with specific learning disabilities. And one interpretation that we have for that is that even circumstances that are coming from high SES contexts are not enough to overcome the fact that when you have an issue like dyslexia, that will manifest itself in ways that are going to be challenging for your school experience and your reading experiences. High SES is not enough to undo the challenges that students with reading disabilities face. There are a lot of things that it can help with, but it can't erase that challenge. I think all of us know that. The way in which our brain works when we have reading challenges is different, and the way in which it's going to manifest in test scores is going to capture that. And our goal is to give these students all the resources they need to maximize their potential and their feeling that they deserve to be readers, and the feeling that the struggles along the way will be worthwhile. So with this context, it gives us some index into thinking about vulnerability and how this double burden of lower SES and having learning disabilities can be a challenge. I'll just say a quick note. For this data set, because you can't diagnose a learning disability in kindergarten, the way that we did this was we asked in third grade who ended up with a diagnosis, and then we looked backwards to see, okay, now of those kids, where did they begin and what was their trajectory to get to the third grade piece? So that just gives us a bit of context here. So building off of this question, we can just expand our story of thinking about how SES and reading disability are related. So we already know that reading disabilities are the most prevalent type of learning disability. So learning disability can be in reading, math, spelling, written expression, etc. But the reading challenge is the most dominant of all the learning disability types, and it impacts about 5 to 10% of school children, depending on how you measure it. And of course, our reading and language skills are very strongly tied together. So this is part of what is really helpful. Some of our students will have really amazing assets in listening to something and remembering it and learning it. And that is something to help them overcome their learning challenge in part, if that is a resource they're able to tap. The challenge is that, as we saw in the earlier graph, students who are from lower SES contexts are disproportionately greater risk of reading vulnerabilities because they're at a higher risk for their language and their literacy, the two of those intertwined very tightly. And I wanted to unpack for us a little bit what our understanding is of how reading disabilities are influenced by environmental factors or context versus genetic factors. So let me give you a bit of an explanation for what the contributions are across the continuum of SES. Genetics, which will be represented with the double helix here, and environment, which is represented by the image here with the tree. So we're going to just think this through, how reading disability is understood in terms of genetics and environment across the continuum of SES. So here's how I break that down. When we think about the range of SES, there's actually a difference between high and low SES in terms of which, in terms of what's contributing to reading challenges. So what do I mean by that? Well, first, when we think of lower SES backgrounds, students from lower SES backgrounds have a greater influence of environment in contrast to genetics. And that's because even if your genetics do not give you a predisposition toward any reading vulnerability, the fact that your environment may not offer all the resources sufficient to help you with the progress you'd like to make, that environment is going to weigh heavier, and that's going to have a bigger influence on your vulnerability as a reader. And in contrast, when we think of higher SES background, in that context, we can make believe for a moment that high SES translates to an optimized environment, which is not always the case by any means. And so in the context of students who are coming from higher SES backgrounds, oftentimes environment doesn't have much as much predictive capacity to explain why reading disabilities are happening. Often everyone's tried everything, and there's one of the major factors explaining it more than what's happening in their context or environment are the genetic side. So for lower SES, the genetic influence on reading disabilities is lower, and the environmental influence on reading disabilities is higher. And the opposite is true for higher SES. So the genetic influence on reading disabilities is higher for higher SES, and the environmental influence is lower. So this gives us just a bit of context to think about what are the contributors and how does that range across the SES continuum. So in the literature, in the research world, what's been so interesting is that it's been quite common for research studies to say, I'm interested in socioeconomic status and reading. So I'm going to study kids' reading ability, but those studies almost always focus on kids who are doing well in their reading, mid or high achieving readers. And in contrast, they often leave out readers who are vulnerable. And similarly for research coming from the reading story, when they recruit participants to join, they are often most able to recruit participants who are interested and available and have the bandwidth to participate in research. There's a name for this, it's called convenience sampling. And that's referring to the situation where most often in research, you're not capturing the full range of SES. Instead, you're often capturing mid and high SES. In other words, families who might have the bandwidth, time, resources to make it to your research facility or have the time to participate. And that leaves a particular group of students who are overstudied in the check marks and understudied, which is in the X's here. So students who are both vulnerable from the SES perspective and the reading ability level are the ones who are least studied and least well understood. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to think about that group as well. So with that context, I want to share some of the work that we've been exploring. And in our research, one thing you can see here is on the bottom, it's going to represent SES. And then you'll see that each y-axis here is a different skill. We have cognition, we have vocabulary, we have listening comprehension, we have word reading. And for every single one of them, the higher your SES is, the higher your achievement is on this. That's the first thing I invite you to take notice of. The second thing I invite you to take notice of is not every circle is on that line, even though it represents the group. There's a lot of scatter. There's a lot of variability. And SES is not deterministic for any individual. It's just that on average across groups or across individuals, these patterns are extremely consistent, that SES shows this association with performance favoring higher SES participants. So in this research context, I want to bring in some of our neuroscience work that's lent some insight into what is the relationship of SES among students who are vulnerable readers with reading difficulties. So what's amazing to see here is, imagine we are often used to seeing the wrinkly versions of brains. Imagine that we're a balloon that I kind of blew up so you can see all the ridges smoothed out so I can see the surface of the brain. So that's what you're seeing here. And you're seeing the left and right, the inside and outside, and even the bottom of the brain. And what you're seeing is the regions of the brain highlighted in red are regions that are associated with SES. So SES positive, I'll read this chunk and I'll explain it. SES positively correlated with cortical thickness in key language and reading areas more strongly than reading scores. So what that means is the higher SES context your home setting was categorized as, the more you had cortical thickness. That's one way that people measure brain structure in these regions. And these regions that are being highlighted, I can go into detail if anyone is interested, but they're highly supportive of our skill sets for listening to language, translating language to print, remembering words you've seen before, and kind of managing our task along the way. So not only is SES at the level of reading performance manifesting, but SES is also manifesting when we think about and look at the brain science. But here's where our focus circles back to what is the malleable parts of what is malleable and what are the opportunities for impact. So one of the research studies I conducted with my colleagues asked the question, if we bring in students across the spectrum of SES, all of them vulnerable readers, all of them early on in their elementary school years, and we give them a strong intervention program, can we boost their skills? And we did this importantly during the summer. So this is something I could talk about for a very long time, but I'll give us a short introduction to this. It used to be that the summer was the only time period where we thought about extended, suspended learning from school, because we have these weeks and weeks or during summer vacation that are almost universally shared for all school children, where everyone no longer has the consistent access to curricular resources, schedules, even food and exercise opportunities and so forth. In the summer, everyone is doing whatever is available to them and whatever is in the bandwidth of their family circumstances. So in the summer, one of our findings that I want to share is we have found that for struggling readers, those who joined an intervention by random assignment, so we just invited students to join us and randomly assigned a group to get intervention during the summer and a group to not get intervention over the summer. And on average, the students who joined the intervention avoided summer slump. And the students who were not part of the intervention showed significant decline in their reading skills. And so the context of this slide here is that when we asked the question of those kids who showed the biggest boosts in their scores, those biggest boosts came from the students who are from lower SES backgrounds. So the first takeaway point of that is that lower SES, again, is not deterministic. It was actually wonderful to see that the students who needed it the most were able to take away the most from the reading program. And not only that, but of our higher SES participants, about a quarter showed improved reading scores. And some of them were able to maintain their scores. So one of our findings is that in the summer context for struggling readers, sometimes treading water is success as opposed to swimming to the next milestone, if the default for some kids might be to have some attrition or some vulnerability amplified through the circumstances of their summer reading experiences. So not only did we find that the intervention was especially positive for our most struggling readers and for our students from the lower SES context, but also amazingly translated to brain findings. So what we found from the brain side for these students who came through our reading intervention program, so what you're seeing in the blue region, in the blue highlighted parts of the brain, you're seeing regions of the brain where the brain structure was changed as a result of the reading intervention. And again, these are picking up on core regions that are extremely important for the brain to be able to pick up on the sounds and symbols that are important for our written language. So another takeaway point here is that for our most vulnerable readers, those who are lower SES and with reading difficulties, this intervention program was able to not only improve reading scores, but also to represent that change in the way that the brain was wired in key regions that support reading and language development. This, by the way, is what many of your, if any of you have students or children at the Carroll School, this brain changing piece is one of the features hopefully you're seeing the other side of on a regular basis, because this is the result of impactful education, rewiring of the brain to support the way in which it can process and understand and analyze and engage with important content. So one thing I want to bring this back to is the home setting. So while lots of great work might be happening in schools like Carroll and beyond, of course, what's also important is having the resources and knowledge to think about what about the home setting can be supportive of the students who live there. So when we think of this, there's a phrase, home literacy environment, HLE, that researchers refer to. And there's something really positive to share about this particular idea. So first, I'll tell you what it is. Home literacy environment entails the resources, interactions, and attitudes that a child is exposed to at home. And what is really wonderful is that home literacy environment factors can be even more impactful and important than SES. So this is where we get to the piece where SES is a proxy for something. And the details are, when you think about the home setting, there are a lot of features that can be modified or improved or changed to amplify the positive impact that home setting can have on a student's language and literacy outcomes. So what might those be? So let's unpack each of the three of these resources, interactions, and attitudes pieces to think them through. I'll start with attitude, which is going backwards. So I'll give the example of math, just to sidestep for a moment. It's not so uncommon for us to hear someone say, I am not a math person. I don't do that, whatever that might be. I need my calculator, I can't process that, or whatever way in which it's sometimes common practice for people to explain that some academic skill is just not how they identify themselves to be. I'm not a math person. Now, in a context where students, children, your children are experiencing that kind of modeling, it's something that they can pick up on, to think like, well, I'm not a reading person, I just can't do it. And I'm going to flip it to offer the opportunity for that to be different. So for many of our students who struggle, it is no wonder that they don't identify as someone who's a good reader, who deserves to be a reader, who likes to read, who feels ownership over the skill, and therefore ownership over access to all of the things that that skill has to give you. So this idea of home literacy environment attitudes around literacy can be reflected in how often modeling is offered of books, how people describe their value added onto the reading experience, how people describe or talk about reading as a skill that's important or not. So I know there's one factor to think about. Another one is the interactions. So when we are able to have a child sit next to us, or we read to them or they read to us, the ways in which we engage and talk about books and what they're trying to communicate, all of these are, again, opportunities for really amplifying the potential to make meaning from print and all of the coded content that it imbues. So around this factor of interactions, there's a lot of opportunity for amplifying impact. And the first one, resources. So it used to be the case in the research context that the number of books in the home was one of the most robust predictors of literacy in students. And the reason you can imagine is that the number of books in a home might represent a lot of things. Maybe how often you go to the library, maybe how often you're buying new books and have things to read that are refreshing. But number of books in the home now with the digital book reading might be a little more difficult to measure that. But the amount of access you have to resources like books, and I'll even add for this audience in particular, even access to audiobooks are ways in which the access to literacy related resources can be really important and enhancing. So from that context, I'll build off of that to introduce this faucet. And the faucet is here because we have something in the research context referred to as the Faucet Theory. It has its very own theory. And this is relevant to the time of year that's coming up, the summertime. So there's an idea that for students who are coming from lower SES backgrounds during the school year, that faucet, which represents access to educational resources, is flowing. We've got access to material resources, we've got access to reading experiences, But when the summer months hit and when school is over, or when things like the pandemic influenced us so much, that faucet is turned down, and it could range all the way from off to a dribble and so forth. And so the idea of having the continuity of resources flowing is a way to keep our lens aware of what opportunities there are for impact. So it is the reading experiences, it is the access to materials in home or at library or at school that are important to think about with continuity. But of course, there are challenges, especially faced by those from homes who are lower SES. So these challenges from a structural inequality perspective can also contribute to disparities in children's language and learning. So what does that translate to? Well, low SES tends to encompass the idea of financial scarcity that can cause a lot of psychological stress on caregivers. And it can also then reduce the amount of speech directed toward the child. And child-directed speech is one of the things that has been flagged as something really important and formative for students to be exposed to. Another category, or I'll add one more thing, which is constraints on lower income caregivers' time is another issue. So that there may not be available, there might be physical limits to the time they can invest in educational opportunities. Another issue is that caregivers with lower educational attainment may just not know a lot about child development and the factors that promote child development that's helpful. So it might limit their motivation to provide cognitively stimulating early environments. And also there could be inequities at the starting gate. As we already mentioned, these structural barriers and others can really intertwine to amplify learning inequalities. Now, it's likely that almost every one of you in attendance tonight knows about additional barriers that might be even more close to home for you. So when we think about the barriers of financial barriers, the barriers of how much time and the kind of information you need, all of these are hugely important features that are in the specific realm of students with learning disabilities, especially in reading and accessing services. So again, I know this is probably overly familiar for many of you. The first thing is how costly it is to get evaluations for students, especially in the context, at least, of pursuing something outside of the school setting. So the cost that comes with neuropsych evaluation can range, I've only ever seen the cost in the multiple thousands of dollars, ranging from 3 to 5 or so. That often comes with the cost also linked to an advocate if that was a resource, or a lawyer if that was a resource, or paying for school. Of course, time is another barrier. In order for someone to be able to access the resources that a struggling reader may need, it requires their time to take note of what vulnerabilities their child may be experiencing. I have a lot of people who shared during the pandemic, they picked up on their child's reading challenges that they were never aware of because of how much more time they had to see what that child was doing in a learning context. But that time also translates to how many hours Googling IDEA or evaluation or all of the nomenclature and burden of terminology that comes along with getting acclimated to the world of reading difficulties. And that ties into the information piece. The information piece as a barrier is also important because many people are not aware of what they're legally entitled to and how they're able to pursue it and how they're able to get through to the resources that are important. In our research, one thing that we discovered that many of you may have actually lived is that from the time a student starts struggling to the time that they have an IEP-based change implemented in their school, usually averages about 13 and a half months. So a child today who's newly recognized and flagged and identified as a struggling reader will on average wait at least a year before they actually have any changes to their programming. And that's a year that is costly in every way. So all of this is to say to this crowd who's fortunate and privileged enough to be part of the Carroll School community, I'm so glad for you because it is a place where whatever barriers you may have gotten through to get here, I'm excited for you and your families to benefit from that kind of education and that kind of community. So I wanted to bring us to this current context of 2020 and beyond, and just loop in some of the information that's relevant from the perspective of the pandemic, and just speak to what that translates to for the story of reading performance. So one thing to share, this is just grades K through 3, as you can see, but one thing that was really helpful was this data laid out before the pandemic to during the pandemic. There were fewer kids who were at or above grade level, and there were more kids who were well below grade level. And that it was for kindergarten, first, second, and third grade. And this probably doesn't surprise anyone, but I'll give it some context, which is when you're in early elementary school, it's when you're establishing the foundational knowledge that you will then draw from the rest of your reading career. And so that time period, which essentially really is kind of embedded in this K-3 time for most students, of course not at Carroll, that time period is really precious in the sense of laying down that foundation. And so for students who are not able to access the curriculum or benefit from schooling, and we're also managing that first year of the pandemic, you can see that vulnerability translated to more readers not meeting the mark. Now, that is also interesting because it was broken down into what aspects of reading were vulnerable. So one thing that stood out was here, they're showing in the darker blue what might have been expected from just a summer loss or gain. So we don't expect kids to learn as much outside of school as they do in school. So the summertime that some of the skills regress, or there's different words for it, but this attrition of skills from the dark blue is what's attributable to typical summer experiences. The lighter blue is what is on top of that came with the pandemic experience. And what stands out here, especially, is that for young students, the way in which they were able to parse the sounds of language, that's referred to as phoneme segmentation, and the way in which they were able to represent the sounds that letters make took the biggest hits on those areas. Now, so much of what we've discussed so far really breaks up the story into vulnerability and risk, and I've referred to the story of resilience a little bit, and I'd like to just amplify that side a little bit more. So while we talked about different types of risk factors, I want to bring the story a bit more full circle to the side of resilience. And this is all still contextualized with the pandemic story. So one thing I will just articulate here for the resilience side, things that counter the risk of vulnerable readers or readers with disabilities like dyslexia or otherwise are, of course, having access to good instruction. Also, things like being able to foster the way in which you process benefit from something. Let me say it this way. I'm referring to growth mindset. And what growth mindset means is that I can either think I'm smart or not, or I'm good or I'm bad at something. And that's a fixed mindset. That's in contrast to a growth mindset where I can say, you know, I might not be good at this right now, but if I keep working at it or I get practice or help, I can get better. And so this idea of a growth mindset being a factor in the resilience category, you can see how that plays out. We also have family and peer support as a really important aspect of resilience. Having an adult in your life as a child who you can trust and rely on, having coping strategies that are supportive, having families that understand what it is or means to have a learning challenge is a hugely important one as well. So these are factors I want to unpack a little bit and share recent work we just submitted for publication this past weekend. So we wanted to know during the pandemic, during that first year of the first full school year during the pandemic, we worked with students who were in grades 11 or 12, all of whom had language-based learning disabilities. So we had all these adolescents join us, and we asked the question, when it comes to risk factors and when it comes to resilience factors, how do they help us predict reading over time for students with language-based learning difficulties? So we wanted to see how reading over time was predicted by factors that were either risk or resilience. The risk factors were things like anxiety, depression, COVID-19 related PTSD, or perceived COVID impact. How much did you think COVID really impacted you or impacted your family? The resilience factors included things like growth mindset we just spoke about, and a few other categories that I'll go into in even more detail later. And we wanted to know, well, is the burden of risk so heavy during the pandemic that that's really relating to your reading outcomes, or might the resilience factors be powerful enough to give us a more insight? So we asked, what predicts reading outcomes? And the reading outcomes were reading connected text, reading stories. Was it your category of resilience? Was it your category of risk? Or was it, we added this other category of executive function, your ability to regulate how you feel, think, and do things. And what was really fascinating was that of all those three categories, the single category that predicted reading outcomes during that first full year of schooling during COVID were socio-emotional skills, were the resilience factors. And this felt to me like an exciting insight because it was revealing that the burden that kids carry are very real. And there is no minimizing the risk factors and the challenges of anxiety or depression or PTSD or COVID for that matter. All of those stand as important factors that warrant serious attention. And the way in which students tap into their resilience skills is actually the most powerful predictor of all of these options for their story of reading. So when we looked a little bit more closely at which of the socio-emotional skills, in other words, which of the resilience factors were the most predictive or the most tightly coupled to reading, the two that popped out were those in bold: self-management and self-efficacy. So for self-efficacy, we asked participants to rate their confidence in the ability to achieve academic outcomes. How confident are you can finish that work that's been assigned? So the more somebody felt confident in that capacity, the more resilient they were, and the more positive their reading outcomes were. And for self-management, we asked participants to consider their skill with self-regulation in the classroom in the past 30 days. Like, how often did you follow directions in class and so forth? So these are categories, these are opportunities to think about how can we support students to be fostering these aspects of their resilience profile, and how do we support them in doing so in service of their reading outcomes. So all this is to really bring together the malleable factors that are important for reading. And I'll just put it into a bit of a broader framework, so you have some opportunities for processing it further. So even though we know our readers with learning challenges have these risk factors, there are ways to minimize the severity of reading challenges that we all know. But in this context, I'll just introduce the two ways as socio-emotional protective factors and cognitive protective factors. And I'll break down each of what those translate to foster good functional outcomes. So in the category of cognitive resilience, these are factors that have been identified in the literature as lending themselves toward improved reading performance. So in our classrooms, when students have reading instruction that fosters their awareness of the units of meaning in words, that's what a morpheme refers to. That's one way in which they can access text with some more additional facility, because they can recognize units of meaning that are smaller than a word. In addition, vocabulary, the richer someone's vocabulary is, the more they're going to have to bring to the task of reading. And their vocabulary can serve as an asset for them to be able to figure out words that they may not know by looking at them, but they can pick up through context and by decoding and pairing those together. Also, your ability to reason through verbal information is also a mechanism for comprehension. The more you can think about the process of thinking and be metacognitive about that process, that's been an asset as well. So the additional two categories there of grammar and executive functions are two other ideas that people have brought up as supportive of reading difficulties. So what does that mean? How do we translate that to action? So for one thing, when students have strengths in oral language, that's something to really be nurtured. Another thing is that for children who have early problems in those, it's important to step in as early as possible with effective intervention and assessment to get a sense of what's the overall constellation of strengths and challenges. Students should also be encouraged to practice using their vocab knowledge to help them figure out and correctly pronounce unfamiliar words. And also thinking about offering students guidance and setting goals and self-monitoring their behavior and their progress, so they're building up their inventory of effective executive function skills. So I'll just round this out by talking about the socio-emotional resilience factors that can be protective. So there's lots of categories here organized in different ways. I'll just point out that from the home setting, these factors, some of them are in clunky language, but family cohesion, maternal affect, paternal attachment, and parental support of understanding reading difficulties. I'll again just give kudos to all of you in attendance tonight and all of you who have committed so much of your every day to understanding reading and how it unfolds differently in all our readers, because that is one of the most important pieces that you can offer, is understanding of the students in your in the classrooms and the children in your homes. We also have the idea from the classroom side of having small class sizes and mentorship by teachers and teacher support. I know many of you at the Carroll School are able to benefit from that in your educational settings as well. And a few other pieces I'll just leave for our reference. What does this translate to? Well, one, students with dyslexia and learning challenges need to feel like they have some type of control in their lives, because in so many categories they don't. So they don't really have a choice. We can change jobs, we can call in sick one day, we can reroute, but if you're under 18, your everyday job is to go to school, regardless of how much you want to or how much you like it. So this idea of agency and control can come in many different ways. It could be, okay, need you to read a book. Here are 3, you pick the one that you want to read. Or this agency around topic or any ways in which it can be enhanced is something that can really be empowering to students. This idea that parents can also increase a child's sense of worth by seeking to understand their strengths and weaknesses is a hugely important piece, as I mentioned earlier. And likewise, teachers and peers playing important roles in the self-esteem of students with dyslexia is also an important piece. So there are a lot of mentoring programs that are really effective, whether it's with peers or teachers alike. There's a program called Eye to Eye, spelled EYE. That's a mentoring program for older students at the college level, mentoring younger students, all of whom have learning challenges. So by that way, I'd like to just start to wrap us up here and introduce the idea that as you unfold into the summer experience, first, kudos for surviving another COVID year from whatever circumstances you did so. And secondly, if you're thinking about entry points for impact in the home setting, I'm sharing with you a figure here that's very well used in the world of reading. And if you haven't seen it, I'll explain it briefly by showing you that at the tail end, we have intertwined strands representing skilled reading. And if we unfurl those a little bit, we have 2 main categories. One is word recognition. At the word level, can I read it? Can I decode it? And the other category is language comprehension. Without looking at anything, this is just oral language. Can I hear and use language in ways that are helpful? If you're thinking about is my child reading books all summer the only solution to helping them get somewhere, I want to share this with you to share some opening up of opportunities. Ultimately, our readers become stronger when they get access to print and recognize words with more comfort, and also in parallel have experiences and exposure to information that enhances their language. These are equally important for the skill of reading comprehension. So if your summer experiences are going to include unique experiences, field trips, new and novel opportunities you can take as a family for new memories and for new exposure to the first time to X, Y, or Z place, all of that adds up in the inventory of background knowledge. And that's one of the most predictive pieces of how well students can come to the task of comprehension of reading, because they have some familiarity with the concepts that they may come across. In addition, the kind of vocabulary that students have, the wider and deeper their vocabulary, the more impactful. So taking time to explain words or to ask about how people understand words and how flexible they could be in their use is another opportunity. And just more broadly, just engaging with language opportunities and experiences. Of course, reading remains always an important piece, and that's for each family to really navigate during the summer. But I will offer that there are a lot of resources for audiobooks. So if any of these organizations are not on your radar, they offer the opportunity for books to be available to you digitally for either just listening to or listening to and following along for students who may not be as inclined to read independently. So with that, I'd like to just bring us full circle to the beginning where we wanted to talk about diversity from the angle of SES and learning challenges and factor in the brain systems and the malleable factors and bring us to the conclusion. I'll say, as promised, the email here is where you can share additional questions we may not cover in the remainder of our session today. And for next steps, some of you might be interested in something along the lines of a research opportunity. And the timing is amazing because my research lab, we're called the BEAM lab or the Brain, Education and Mind Lab. We're currently recruiting families who have students who are finishing up grades 4, 5, or 6 to join a virtual reading study where we will see you on Zoom at the beginning and end of the summer. We're happy to share score reports and share a gift card also for your time. I'm happy to share more information about that, so please follow up if that feels useful. And then in the slide deck that you'll receive, I also included at least one article that's free access and available in English and Spanish on the topics we covered today. So I will share my contact slide for future reference, but most importantly, I'll leave the slide up here and thank you deeply for your time tonight. Thank you.
Joanna, thank you so much. Thank you. We were gathering questions while you were speaking. They fall kind of broadly into 2 categories, those from our Carroll educators and those from parents. And I think kind of just globally tying those 2 together, I think a bunch of us, parents and educators, wonder with our sort of power and privilege of being or working at Carroll, parents, faculty, staff, what can we do to help more vulnerable populations?
Well, first, the generosity of that question is really touching because it offers such a lens of just community-oriented thinking, which I really admire. I think there's a couple entry points for impact as a community at Carroll. I think the fact that you found your way to a place that can support your readers in such a strong way is already a contribution to the greater good because that's positive for that child, for that family, and for that community. More broadly, the things that people are taking from a place like Carroll, I assume, and I'd love to hear from people, I think of it in at least 2 categories. One category is the knowledge piece around what does it mean for a student to have a reading vulnerability and how do I help them? And the second category is community. And the kind of community that Carroll builds for the staff, the educators, and the students and families who attend is something that can be shared. Most people with reading challenges don't have access to a school like Carroll. And that means that there are probably families in your neighborhood, in your setting, in your life who may not know what's possible and that there is something possible to help their child who may not have the same access to opportunities. So I think this idea of extending community to readers of all varieties is one way for impact. I know that Carroll also does a lot of professional development with community schools, and the potential to do that, especially to communities of need, is another entry point.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Just kind of quickly on the educator side, from your perspective, what does good reading intervention look like?
Right. So the answer to what good intervention looks like, my first answer is it depends, because it depends on what a child might need. So I think my generic answer is disappointing because it's unspecific. It's non-specific. However, I can tell you that readers who are successful, I'll specify it. There was a really wonderful research study exclusively with readers with dyslexia who were adults, and they were all successful adults. And the question that the researcher asked was, if I interview all these people, is there something in common that I can learn that helped these particular readers who had so much trouble early on get to these really amazing outcomes as adults? And there was one feature that they all shared in common, which was they all found a topic that was really high interest to them. Whether that was lawnmowers, whether that was the economy, whether it was whatever it may be, this opportunity for students to find that for themselves. And that can change over time. But I think the opportunity to find an area of passion and hobby and to use that as an entry point to want to learn more through reading and through accessing materials is one way to kind of drive toward that success.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Kind of staying with that theme of kind of an educator perspective just for a moment, you touched for just a minute on attentional challenges in one of the slides, and we at Carroll have between 40 and 60% of our student body has attentional challenges, whether they're diagnosed or not. Can you elaborate just for another minute or two on that subset?
Absolutely. We actually just this morning got a paper published on that topic, so I'll share at least what that paper found.
Wonderful.
So the statistic at Carroll is very similar to the general population. Individuals with dyslexia have co-occurring ADHD in roughly 40% of the cases. So a lot of these cases are underdiagnosed as well. Usually students, we had an opportunity to invite students in, and a lot of those students with ADHD were not identified yet. They were exclusively only focused on the dyslexia part. So one thing I'll share about that is, while they frequently co-occur, you might be wondering, well, how do they potentially interact or impact each other? And one surprising finding for us was that first we found that for students with ADHD, it's often synonymous to equate ADHD with executive function challenges. And one thing that we found was that that's not accurate. Only half of the cases of ADHD had presentation of executive function challenges. The second surprise, or the second insight, was that when we asked the question, what matters more for reading outcomes for struggling readers? Is it the ADHD or is it executive function? The answer was executive function. So ADHD co-occurs with dyslexia, but only if you have executive function challenges as well is it going to impact your reading scores in a more burdensome way. So that was a way to kind of tease apart what is ADHD and when can it impact reading outcomes. And what was so interesting from that finding was that we found that evidence at both the level of reading outcomes and also the way the brain is wired. So we found different signatures of dyslexia, not when you look at dyslexia co-occurring with ADHD, but yes, when you look at executive function deficits plus plus dyslexia.
We're going to have you back next year to present just on that, right? And I mean, some of us were kind of side chatting the curiosity around this sort of self-belief, just the grit, the resilience versus, and this is my language, but just confidence. Confidence is like, oh, I know I can do it, but versus the belief, like, I think I can. Any more to say about that topic? Because we found it so interesting.
I think what's really amazing to analyze further is a lot of times when our students come to us, or our kids or students, come to adults not feeling great about their reading, there's something that makes perfect sense, that you wouldn't feel great about a skill that you don't feel you have really well. So those of us who are great dancers, no hesitation, we hear music and get right up. And those of us who are not great dancers would try and hide and maybe avoid that attention. And it's no different for the reading realm, but it's much higher stakes. And so what's really important is to foster students' sense of I can and I deserve to be a reader. And not just to do that part, but in addition to the fostering of the skills that will enable them to feel like they have the skill set to match the tasks that they want to engage with. So I know that those are both areas that are focused on at the Carroll School, which I think is a really powerful combination.
Thank you so much. One person just wanted me to remind the audience that public libraries also provide free audiobooks, and just kind of a phone call to your local library could also do that. Question on the parent side is, can you talk a little bit more about child-directed speech and how a parent can sort of act upon that to have a more positive impact?
Wonderful question. So all these fancy terms, child-directed speech or serve and return, all these things have become in the research world a little bit more popular. And I'll give you some context. There was a study done decades ago that showed that for young kids before school age, what really was predictive of their future academic skill or their language performance in particular was how many words a child heard. And that was tied to different SES contexts. So children in higher SES contexts tended to hear more words, be exposed to more language. And children from lower SES contexts were exposed to fewer words. And so that finding reverberated for years and years as something tied to the story of SES. Very recently, just in the past few years, researchers found that what actually matters more than the amount of words kids hear when they're growing up is how many opportunities there are for just conversations and exchanges. If this is in reference to a baby, you can still do this sort of thing because of the way that you can reflect back the sounds or utterances they're making before they're even able to make words. When this is in reference to young kids, this is the kind of approach where you just want to have, instead of talking to you and I want you to listen only and not talk at all, or the soliloquies that kids sometimes offer us, the potential we have for just that exchange and that back and forth, that engagement is a really powerful entry point. And it's not too much fancier than just having the back and forth.
So just any sort of exchange.
Probably.
Yes, right. Like sounds, words, communication that's verbal.
Yes.
Yes. Are there strategies that you can think of that would help our parents to help to develop resilience in their children?
I think the most important piece that I'm drawing from the content that we shared is understanding, because I think for many of us that feeling of if I don't do well, let me say it this way. There were some really incredibly well-intentioned people. These people have included teachers, leaders, parents, and so forth, who would come with the challenge they were having with a student or a child and say they're so lazy, they're not performing as they should be, they're unmotivated. And that to me was just an opportunity to highlight the much better vocabulary and more accurate understanding of who this child was. So lots of our students are going to have encountered lots of being misunderstood. And I think one of the greatest gifts you can give another human is to give them the chance to be understood. So just being immersed in the story of what does it mean to have a reading disability, as all of you in attendance are, is one of them. And then I also want to offer that if you're thinking about your home experience, especially in the summertime, I know COVID changed all of this, but I used to say that if you're a parent, then what's so helpful is to be able to serve that role and not also feel like you also have to be the tutor and the teacher and the person helping with the decoding and so forth. And again, I know everything is circumstantially messier with the COVID circumstances, but I offer that as part of the explanation.
Wonderful. Joanna, thank you so much. I just want to remind everyone, actually, so there was a question about, would we make the slides available? And I think the answer is yes, we will email these out to participants or make them available. And then again, also, we did record the session. It will be available through registration on the parent portal for any of your kind of colleagues, friends, and so forth. If you want to share out a link. We are enormously grateful to you, Joanna, enormously grateful to you. And we will also, in our Parent Thursday update, share out the link to your study. So we'd love to help you kind of support the research going forward.
Thank you so much, everyone. And whoever's watching the Celtics game, enjoy.
Go Celtics. Everyone have a wonderful Thursday night and a fantastic weekend. And as always, thank you so much for joining us. Take care.